An experienced flight instructor and a student pilot on a training flight crashed the Cessna 172 on a mountain on a cold night in November. The instructor is fatally injured. The student is seriously injured and risks dying of exposure in the freezing wilderness. What could cause an accident like this? Did they fly into bad weather and lose control? Or was there engine trouble and the pilots had no other choice but to try to land on a wooded hillside? Maybe they were practicing training maneuvers and got into a stall spin and could not recover in time. We'll find out what happened, how, and why coming up. The student pilot and flight instructor planned to depart Frederick, Maryland and fly to Winchester, Virginia. After practicing a few takeoffs and landings in Winchester, they would then fly to Charlottesville, Virginia. Afterward, they would return to Frederick. They probably intended to backtrack along the same route, flying to Winchester again on the way home, because a straight line from Charlottesville directly to Frederick would be hassled by more restrictive airspace around Washington, D.C. The purpose of the flight would be for the student to fulfill the night cross-country flight training required for a private pilot certificate. The day before the flight, the student performed preparation work as requested by the instructor. It appears the student planned the flight on paper charts, but may have used electronic tools to assist the process. The pre-flight planning procedure would typically involve drawing the route on an aeronautical chart, determining course settings in degrees, and measuring distances to the destination airports as well as intermediate landmarks to serve as checkpoints. This information would then be entered onto a pre-flight planning form and navigation log similar to this one. Just prior to the flight, an up-to-date winds aloft forecast would be used to complete the form with the wind correction angles necessary to track the desired courses, the heading and tailwind components and resulting ground speeds, and the estimated time and route for each leg. The student emailed the instructor the night before the flight with copies of his planning and preparation work. The next morning, the instructor emailed back and said that it looked good. The day of the flight, the student was scheduled to arrive at 4 p.m. This would allow them plenty of time to finalize preparation for the flight while waiting for the sun to set. However, when the student arrived, the instructor expressed confusion about whether Charlottesville was actually far enough away for the flight to count toward the FAA requirement and subsequently announced a change of plans. They would still fly to Winchester, but then instead of Charlottesville, the instructor decided that they would fly to the Inglesfield Airport in Hot Springs. This would make the flight significantly longer than originally planned. Interestingly, the route to Hot Springs crosses the sectional chart boundary onto another chart. The instructor did not give the student an opportunity to replan the flight to the new destination, nor did the instructor perform the pre-flight planning himself. Instead, they obtained a weather briefing, and the student performed a routine pre-flight inspection of the airplane. They would still be ready for takeoff by 5 p.m. as they originally planned. The NTSB investigated this accident and published its final report after 15 months. During the investigation, they interviewed the student pilot from his hospital room, conducted an autopsy of the flight instructor, and analyzed the wreckage. Even though the pilots of this flight were not in communication with air traffic control, officials combed through ATC radar recordings and were able to identify the flight's track. And of course, they looked at weather reports in the area. The weather was good, with clear skies, good visibility, and calm winds. The aircraft and its engine were operating normally. The radar track showed the aircraft flying straight on a constant heading at approximately 3,000 feet, with no unusual maneuvering before impact. Plus, markings on rocks and tree trunks indicated that the airplane struck terrain in an attitude very close to straight and level flight. In addition, no evidence could be found in support of a medical hypothesis such as carbon monoxide poisoning, a cardiopulmonary event, or the influence of medication, drugs, or alcohol. Was the instructor's failure to notice high terrain along the route a careless slip-up or a more egregious error in a systemic pattern? Well, to begin, let's look at the destination airport itself. It's hard to understand why the instructor would have ever chosen an altitude of 3,000 feet for a flight to HSP. It's no secret that this is a remote mountain airport. It's actually the highest elevation public airport east of the Mississippi River. One flight school with locations in the Washington, D.C. area even features flights to HSP as part of a set of special challenge lessons that it offers to pilots who want to expand their skill and experience level. Any aeronautical chart or source of airport information would clearly show the airport elevation 3,793 feet above sea level. Of course, they would need to cross several mountain ridges, including some even higher than that, just to get there. During an examination of the wreckage, it was discovered that the only aeronautical chart on board was a Washington sectional. This chart would have only covered half of the flight from Winchester to Hot Springs. As mentioned earlier, they would have needed a Cincinnati chart for the second half of the flight. Not only did they not have charts on board covering the full route, but the only chart on board was tucked away in the student pilot's flight bag, probably in the back seat and virtually inaccessible to the pilots in flight. If you're wondering whether they might have had an iPad or other electronic device with digital charts on board, well, it appears that they did not. During the post-accident interview, the student pilot stated that there were no aeronautical charts at all available in the cockpit for reference. And the student said that he had asked the instructor about the terrain elevation during the flight, and the instructor replied that he didn't know what the terrain elevation was. The act of skipping pre-flight planning and not having charts on board or even looking at them beforehand is a significant act of negligence and a violation of federal aviation regulations, which require pilots to become familiar with all available information about a flight. What's worse is that the instructor was in effect teaching the student that this level of negligence was unacceptable behavior. Obviously, being a night flight, it was dark outside, but how dark was it? After departing Winchester, the view outside the aircraft windows grew black.
Black as midnight on a moonless night. Pretty black.
Not only were they flying over a sparsely populated area, but at the time of the accident, it was over an hour after sunset, and despite a recent full moon, it would not rise for another half an hour. The most obvious explanation is that they didn't see the mountains because it was simply too dark outside. and the NTSB did include this in their final report as an environmental factor. Any moonlight at all, even just a sliver, might have allowed them to see what was coming. However, there may have been some additional factors. Both occupants may have been distracted by a seemingly impromptu autopilot demonstration on the part of the instructor. The autopilot lesson may have resulted in both the instructor and the student focusing on the instrument panel, and what's worse is that the autopilot in this airplane is typically installed at the bottom of the avionics stack, requiring them to look down at a significant angle. They may not have noticed the mountain coming for them even if there had been adequate moonlight. Finally, it's imaginable that they may have had the lights in the cockpit turned up more brightly than necessary. Overly bright cockpit lighting would cause poor night adaptation of the eyes as well as cast reflections onto the inside of the windows, making it more difficult to see outside. Clearly, the instructor failed to perform basic due diligence before embarking on this flight, maybe because he was in a rush to get going after the last-minute change in destination. But why did the instructor change it in the first place? As mentioned before, the instructor reportedly seemed confused about the minimum distance they needed for this flight. For some background, a private pilot certificate requires a minimum of 40 hours of flight time, although the average is much higher than that. As part of the total flight time requirement, at least 20 hours must be dual and at least 10 hours solo. Of the 20 hours of dual instruction, the student must receive at least 3 hours of cross-country instruction and 3 hours of night instruction. At the intersection of these requirements is a single night cross-country flight, and it was this requirement the instructor was aiming to check off. In general, a cross-country flight must include a point of landing at least 50 miles away from the original point of departure, but it may include stops at intermediate airports before or after the 50-mile point. And you may count the return portion back to the original point of departure towards the hour requirement and any total distance requirements. The night cross-country specifically requires a flight of 100 nautical miles total distance. Although this could be a flight 100 miles one way, it is more common to meet this requirement by making a round trip to an airport at least 50 miles away. Both the outbound and return portion of the flight would count toward the total distance requirement. So what was the instructor confused about? The student's interview with investigators implied the instructor thought that Winchester to Charlottesville was less than 50 miles, even though it is 62. However, what I think actually happened was that the instructor got tripped up by the 100 nautical mile total distance requirement. He may have thought that they needed to fly one way 100 miles. The fact that Winchester to Hot Springs is slightly over 100 at 107 is consistent with this theory. As a side note, I'm excluding the Frederick to Winchester leg from this discussion because it was still daytime during that portion of the flight. Maybe the flight instructor deliberately made the flight longer than required, for example, in order to ensure the student met the minimum of 3 hours of nighttime. Well, the student had already flown at night several times and already exceeded the 3-hour night flight time requirement. Maybe the instructor was trying to make the flight more challenging. Well, without performing the appropriate pre-flight planning or having the requisite charts on board, it's hard to imagine how this flight would have offered any more challenge than a shorter flight. Using a GPS and an autopilot to fly in a straight line for 100 miles is not more challenging than doing the same for 50 miles. It's perplexing why the instructor was so confused about this requirement. He had been a flight instructor for many years and over 1,000 hours of instruction given, and even if he forgot the specifics of this flight, it would have only taken a few minutes to look them up. At this point, it's worth a reminder that this was a pre-SOLAS student in a relatively early stage of training. Giving a night cross-country lesson to the student as unusual as this kind of flight would normally be done at a much later stage. Private pilot training is normally divided into building blocks, where each block of learning is built upon the previous ones. At the most general level, pilot training can be divided into 3 basic stages. Here is an example from the FAA Aviation Instructor's Handbook showing the building blocks that typically are used during the first stage of training, the pre-solo stage. This portion of training focuses on basic airmanship tasks like aircraft control, radio communication, simple emergencies, and of course takeoffs and landings. Once a student masters these, they are signed off for their first solo. After a few solo flights, the instructor would move on to more advanced topics, including night and cross-country flight. I examined 4 commercially available private pilot training syllabi, and none of them have either night or cross-country flights prior to the first solo. In 3 of them, the dual night cross-country occurs after the student first flies at least one solo cross-country. In the 4th, the student does their night cross-country immediately before their first solo cross-country. While the student and instructor in this case were not beholden to strictly follow a comprehensive syllabus like one of these, using one as a guide can ensure training is organized in a logical fashion, introducing each topic when the student is ready for it. Introducing an advanced subject too early in a student's training is likely to fail to achieve the desired learning outcomes. To give an extreme example, a student could legally accomplish the night cross-country requirement on their first flying lesson, but clearly that is not likely to result in a valuable learning experience. An examination of the student's logbook reveals that the premature night cross-country flight is not the only thing peculiar about the student's training. Although the instructor names in the student's logbook were redacted by the NTSB, the handwriting and certificate expiration dates offer some clues about the student's training history. It appears that he had an instructor change during training. The student's first 11 flights all appear to be with one particular instructor. The progression of learning looks rather normal for a pre-solo student. After these 11 flights, the student switched instructors to the one involved in the accident. As soon as he did so, things started to get unusual. First, there's a one-off lesson in a Piper Archer. I generally recommend not switching airplanes, especially before solo, without a good solid reason, as this can retard student progress. By itself, it's not really a big deal, but it's the beginning of a pattern in which the content of the student's lessons seems to get more and more random. After switching back to the Cessna 172 and doing a seemingly normal pre-solo lesson, things get weird again. Over the next 5 flights, 4 of them are at night, including one in actual instrument conditions during which the student logged 2 ILS instrument approaches. An ILS is an advanced procedure taught to private pilots who are pursuing an instrument rating. It is not something that is useful or helpful to a pre-solo student. While a private pilot certificate does require 3 hours of training in flight by reference to instruments, this is typically done with a view-limiting device and is treated as an emergency situation. Later, the student would say that he felt very comfortable flying at night or IFR in glass panel equipped aircraft. It seems like he missed the point of the lesson, or rather the instructor missed the point when he taught this lesson. Another peculiar flight is labeled as lost procedures, a lesson typically done soon before a solo cross-country flight. Since this was an early student, the content of this lesson would likely be forgotten by the time the student needed it. The flight instructor was pilot in command or PIC of this flight and was responsible for a safe outcome. Most aircraft crashes can be described as an accident chain, a series of events that occur one after another where simply breaking any one link in the chain would avoid the accident. The chain in this case started when the PIC decided to give a pre-solo student an arguably premature lesson on night cross-country flying. Had the student been more advanced, he may have been equipped to serve as a check and balance on the instructor's decision making. The PIC misunderstood the FAA requirement and unnecessarily changed the destination at the last minute, selected an airport in mountainous terrain, and decided to launch without performing any pre-flight planning and did not carry the necessary charts on the flight. He chose a relatively low altitude. Even if the terrain had been flat, a flight on a dark night in a single-engine airplane is best done with plenty of altitude in case of an engine failure. He did not obtain flight following from air traffic control. Although this is an optional service, ATC may have caught the low altitude and provided a safety alert. He had poor situational awareness regarding the geography and probably was not aware beforehand that there would be a complete lack of moonlight. He ignored the student pilot's concern about terrain and instead proceeded with a possibly distracting autopilot demonstration just before impact. Along the chain that led to this accident, we can see several examples of the FAA's hazardous attitudes. Safety is improved when pilots are able to identify their own hazardous attitudes so they can consciously counteract them. The instructor exhibited impulsivity when he changed the destination at the last minute and proceeded to take off without any preparation. The instructor exhibited invulnerability by seemingly having a lack of respect for the unique risks posed by night flight. The instructor exhibited resignation when the student asked him about terrain and he replied that he didn't know. We can also see that the instructor fell into some of the FAA's operational pitfalls. The instructor had his mind set on getting the night cross-country done and did not consider teaching an alternative lesson. Given the longer flight, the instructor probably wanted to avoid delays in order to not get home too late at night, a form of get-there-itis. If the instructor ever had positional or situational awareness to begin with, he certainly lost it at some point. But the clearest and most obvious problem on this flight was neglecting flight planning. The instructor was highly experienced, but in this case, his experience apparently led to a false sense of security. After flying hundreds of hours at night safely, the instructor likely had become overly comfortable with the additional risks and hazards posed by night flight, evident not only by the accident flight but the student's previous flights with this instructor. Night risks could have been mitigated by selecting a route over more hospitable terrain. A route like this one could have been planned and flown in less time than it would take to fly one way to HSP and would have given them several airports along their route that could serve as diversionary airports in case of an emergency or a need for a precautionary landing. Optional tools and safety nets such as flight following and flight plans would have been beneficial, and as a flight instructor, I recommend using these especially on night cross-country flights. The PIC not only failed to perform his duties as pilot in command, but failed his role as a teacher. He set a bad example for the student, and there was an apparent lack of learning objectives. All other things the instructor did not do on this flight were missed opportunities for the instructor to teach the student how to do these things and for the student to practice them. The instructor not only had no plan for the flight itself, but no apparent plan for what to teach on this flight. The only goal seemed to be to check off an FAA-required box while missing the bigger picture. While there are many lessons that can be learned here, one of the biggest might be that experience alone does not make someone a safer pilot. Pilots must continually apply sound decision-making and risk management to every flight, every time. Those who allow themselves to become disconnected from the dangers of flying and let their guard down may be making a fatal mistake.